This is Guy Spear. Welcome to Cappuccino and Conversation. Many of you may be asking, why do a podcast? And there are thousands of new podcasts almost every day. There are many out there, enormous amounts. It's an exploding medium. And I've gone back and forth on it. And there are a few reasons. First of all, although I wrote a book, I don't think that writing is the easiest way for me to express myself. I'm far better expressing myself in the spoken word. And many of the conversations that I wanted to bring to a broader audience are conversations that I'm having anyway. They're conversations that I'm having because of the due diligence that I'm conducting, or because of the conversations that I have with people that I meet along the way. And I often feel that they're so interesting that it's almost a shame that they don't get written up or they don't get shared with a broader audience. So my plan with this podcast is, with the permission of the person that I'm talking to, obviously, to offer them, if they like, to share the conversation with a broader audience and to give you the opportunity to eavesdrop, if you like, on some of the people that I talk to. It's an experiment. Some of my best experiments have failed miserably, and some of the ones that I've expected to fail have ended up being extraordinary. I have no idea how this will turn out, but thank you for being willing to indulge me and to join me in the experiment. In this episode, I invite you to listen into a conversation that I had with Camilla Cavendish. We conducted it really as an experiment. We invited some of our investors, some friends, and then some members of the general public. And we conducted a Zoom seminar. We originally invited, there were about 150 people who registered, and there were 50 people on the seminar. Camilla Cavendish is a columnist for the FT. She's also the author of a fantastic book on aging, which takes a close look at the fact that many of our institutions today are focused on a population in which life expectancy was probably in the 60s, and people would retire not much before that. By contrast, these days, people can be expected to live into their 80s and 90s and perhaps beyond, and retirement ages are often in the 50s, so there's a whole second life and sort of second part of life that needs to be dealt with. But I also talked to Camilla about populism, about the state of politics in the UK, about what to do about China. She has a fiery intelligence, and it's an enormous amount of fun to speak to her. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome, everyone. I have had the opportunity to interact with Camilla most recently in a phone call, but this format gives me the opportunity to ask you, Camilla, all sorts of questions. I've told Camilla that she's totally welcome to rib me in any way possible. And so I've written out some questions, and there's a very successful podcaster called John Lee Dumas, who has a podcast called Entrepreneurs on Fire. And his first question every time is, share something about yourself, Camilla, that most people don't know. You've ended up in a role of writing about the world. But if I pulled up your Wikipedia page, you did not write about the world early on. You were a management consultant for a while. You regenerated the South Bank Center. What pushed you to end up in journalism? It wasn't where you were originally.
My CV is a terrible CV for any headhunter. It kind of makes no sense until almost now, at this point in my career. I was lecturing at Harvard Medical School a few weeks ago because I'm doing a fellowship at Harvard, and actually they wanted me to lecture about sort of journalism and public policy, and I suddenly felt as if my life made sense almost for the first time in my career. But look, I always loved writing. I loved writing as a child. I always secretly wanted to be a journalist, but I grew up with two parents who wrote books all their lives and split up actually over money worries. And I basically grew up with a mother who said, for God's sake, don't ever be a writer. So if you ask me why it took that long, that's why it took that long. But also what the great benefit of it is that having done quite a lot of other different jobs along the way, actually when I finally went into journalism, I had, I think, more to offer. So I say to people, kids who are graduating, who want to get into newspapers or media, I tend to say to them, for God's sake, don't do that. Go and do something in the real world, create some jobs, run a company, whatever it is, and then come to journalism because you've got something to say. And also you need to understand numbers, you need to understand statistics if you're really going to add value. And they don't like hearing that, but I think the kind of people we need in journalism are people who can do proper forensic investigative reporting.
And how many people do you meet in journalism who actually started off and spent their whole lives at a newspaper or similar?
In our generation, quite a lot still. And I'm not saying they're not brilliant, because in the old days, the training schemes were incredible. But equally, I think there's quite a lot of value in people who come in a little bit later, just because they have a better sense of what they're actually writing about.
And do you think that you have a broader set of sources, effectively, or relationships from which to draw upon?
Yeah. So when I went to the Times, I basically joined the Times as a leader writer. So I became chief leader writer of the Times, which basically meant I was writing 5 editorials a week, which is the best possible training. That's how you learn to write. You're writing 600 words every day on a different subject, which is not your, there's what the editor wants you to write about. And if he wants you to write about the Japanese currency and you know nothing about the Japanese currency, exactly as you say, you have to know enough people to call.
Yeah.
And I was very lucky. That was a huge advantage. I had people to call on almost any subject to tell me, how to look at the issue.
And is the first place you go to verbal conversations, or do you go for written sources? Or when do you go for written sources?
I love verbal conversation because I tend to get my ideas from verbal conversation. But I will usually pull up the press cuts on any issue. If I don't really know about an issue, I'll pull up the press cuts first. Because obviously you can't engage experts unless you've got to a ground level of understanding. Otherwise, they're not going to give you the time of day. I always prefer to pick up the phone to somebody. It doesn't mean I'm going to agree with them, but then they will get me to think more clearly about the issue.
So for those of you who are on the call, I was talking to Camilla just beforehand, and I was telling her that the last third of my book, I've changed my thinking on just about everything. But one thing that I have not changed my thinking on is in terms of investment research, getting the order right. So there's this idea that the first idea that enters your brain is the one that sticks. At least when you read material, you have a lot more objectivity. You can move it around a lot. Whereas the first person you speak to, in my case, if it's a salesperson from the corporation, they can really mess with my thinking. And if you pick up the wrong phone or pick up the phone to the wrong person, the PR person for Japanese currency who really wants you to think a certain way, are you not going to be a little bit in their hands?
Yes, and that's why you don't pick up the phone to the PR person ever.
Ever.
When I worked in government, I almost never went. If I wanted to find out what was going on, I didn't go to a minister. I would try and find the person in mid-level rank of Whitehall who really knew what was going on.
And how hard was that to speak to them? Easy enough from
At the beginning, actually, they used to take fright because they'd get a call from number 10 Downing Street and everything, and if they weren't at their desk, there'd be a message and they would all get incredibly hyped up, which I didn't realize because I had spent 10 years as a journalist just ringing people like that.
Yeah. And not getting your calls returned.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. I want to just go back to writing. So for the audience, this is a very personal question for me. I came to Switzerland, and one of the things I had an ambition to do was to write a book. And I had some friends who'd written a book. So the first 3 years, for your interest, Camilla, I was just pushing myself to write some drivel for, 500 to 1,000 words of drivel that I kept in Evernote. And then when a book contract came through, and I was under real pressure, I had to start producing chapters and draft chapters. That is one of the most difficult, stressful, awful difficult times of my life. I felt like I was at a rock face. And the idea that somebody would actually enjoy doing that, because I think that there's incredible power in writing if you like to do it. And people ask me if I am ever going to write a second book. And the answer is absolutely no way. It doesn't make me happy.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because when I read your book, Guy, it's very compelling because you tell personal stories and because you actually start that book with a story about your own failure.
Yeah.
It's really compelling.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, they're not willing to share anything about themselves, and that's why they're not actually very good writers.
Let me help you out how that happened. Palgrave Macmillan gives me a contract and I say, well, I definitely have to take it. I have no idea how this is going to work. But I got to the point where I said, even if it's a bad book, I'd rather have published a book in my lifetime than not have published a book. It's a bit like having a child. You want to become a parent. And in this case, I wanted to become the parent of a book. And now I'm at the rock face, scared stiff, because I'm saying, what on earth can I write about that is going to be compelling for an audience? And part of why the book is so personal is I say to myself, the only thing that I'm truly an expert on and that I can truly be instructive on is my own experience of the world. Yeah. So that kind of deep dive into myself was born out of the pure fear
that I produced something that wasn't worth reading.
It is worth reading. So
Thank you. It's worth also saying that unlike you, and this is for the audience, another conversation that I had with Camilla just the other day as we were preparing this, is that book was extraordinarily heavily edited. I mean, a friend who was editor of Time magazine basically lived with me for 3 months, and we pretty much extensively rewrote every chapter to make it readable. What I understood from you is that you don't really have an editor. What you submit is pretty much what gets printed.
Well, I have a great editor, but he tends to do a slightly more high-level thing, yes. It's like exercising a muscle. I think writing is like anything else. I have spent 15 years of my career writing, and certainly for 10 years writing pretty much every single day. Now, I defy anybody not to get better at it if they put that many hours into it.
Yeah.
I happen to love it, but I've made a hell of a lot less money than you, so maybe you made the right decision.
When I was writing, I got better at it, Camilla, but I still didn't enjoy it anymore. I just found it really
interesting. You know, when you look at how many books are published, which is really intimidating, because actually it's extraordinary that anybody at all has read my book. I mean, I'm so grateful that my book has actually been relatively successful, because I look around me and it's extraordinary how many books are published and how many people take the view you just expressed, which is I'd really like to have written a book.
Yeah.
And we have this veneration for literature and books, which I grew up with. And I think it's just wonderful that we still have that.
Yeah.
Because actually committing to reading through an entire book, and I do that because I review books as well, for newspapers, is quite a big deal.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful reflection on our convenience world that we are still willing to stop and take the time to read what someone else has put 2 years of their life into.
We're all grateful to you for spending all your life not thinking about how to make money, or as I sometimes say, how to make rich people richer.
Ah, yes.
And how to communicate. And, I have not been in the UK, but there have been some topics that you've picked up as a journalist. One was a focus on the NHS, where you sort of dove deep. Maybe, and I really know so little about it. Ever since Brexit, I have a subscription to all the British newspapers, but at the time I didn't. And many of the audience members will not know. Maybe you can tell us about what you did there. And perhaps actually also you can give the audience a quick overview of the way British healthcare system is organized.
We're going through an election in the UK. So health is the number one issue after Brexit in this election. It continues to be a major political issue in this country. We don't have a US-style insurance system. We have, as everybody knows, a universal free at the point of need system, but it is sagging under the weight of just incredible, exponentially increasing demand. But the weird thing is you don't really get interested in health until you come into contact with the system yourself. So when I had my first child, ironically in the same hospital that I myself was born in, I had a terrible experience, and it switched me on as a journalist to wondering what on earth this was about. How can something so routine be so appallingly badly managed? At some point during the 2010 election, the Conservatives had made a big deal about health, and the editor of the Times, he and I sat down and we said, well, what are we going to say? What's our editorial line going to be on the NHS? And we realized we didn't know. So he said, and this is very unusual for an editor, he said, go out and spend a month. And a month is quite a lot of time actually to invest from a newspaper, and dig around and see what you come up with. And that's when I got hooked, because healthcare systems are some of the most complex, human and intellectually challenging things. And the NHS, I think, still employs, it's the third largest employer in the world after the Red Army and the Indian Railway Company, I think. But those people are employed in all these different silos which don't talk to each other. So from a systems dynamics point of view, I remain fascinated by it. I then went onto the board of the hospital regulator in England, and I wrote a big independent review for the government about nursing and stuff. And I made some programs for the BBC about it. But my worry now, I suppose, is that we don't invest in prevention. This is common all over the world. We treat people who are sick, but we don't try and actually prevent those illnesses, even though we know quite a lot about how to do it. And we've got tech, we've got genomics, we've got AI, we've got fantastic analytics coming along, but we're not always linking them to the human. So we tend to talk about tech as this kind of wondrous science without remembering we've got to link it to the human.
And your preoccupation really is quite beautiful, because if you think about me, making rich people richer, you're actually trying to make the overall happiness of the British people as a whole greater. You've gone to healthcare because it's one of the key elements of that.
Yeah.
You're in the US, in Boston, every 6 weeks or so?
Yeah, roughly, yes.
So I've no doubt you've gone into multiple conversations and you understand quite well the debate that's going on over there.
Yes.
And it's interesting for me that it was really surprising for me in the 2012 Olympics but the NHS played such a strong role in the actual ceremonies. And it's amazing to see in the election, observing the election, how important the NHS is. And
well, the NHS is our sort of holy grail. It's our national treasure. It's the reason why the current debate about a US-UK trade deal is so fraught with difficulty, because we know that there have been some conversations between American trade officials and British trade officials about prescription drugs, for example. You know, you can have a perfectly sensible conversation about a prescription drug, but the minute it filters out, people leap to the conclusion that you're trying to privatize the whole of our healthcare system. Yeah. And then it's not possible to have any conversation at all at that point.
The hilarious thing in the United States, to the extent that I've observed it, is that when you have people talking about a single-payer healthcare system, the first place that people leap to is, quote, death panels. And there's this idea that you do not want to take the decisions over life and death at end of life, extension of care, whether you allow somebody you pay a lot of money to extend their lives or not,
yes,
is in the hands of somebody, the government. The minute you bring that up, people who might be inclined to accept a single-payer system
right,
sort of like turn away. It's funny for me that some of the same kinds of people who love the single-payer national healthcare system in the United Kingdom,
yes,
the same sorts of people who hear death panel and say, not on my life, I would never, ever want that.
Yes, I think people are rightly skeptical about state ownership of services and whether the state runs things well. So one of the tragic things about the NHS is how much variation there is. There is still far too much variation in even routine operations, depending on where in different locations. That's tragic. That's basically, these are management issues.
Yeah.
The NHS is a weird hybrid, you see. It's centralized and decentralized simultaneously. And that actually makes it very, very challenging to run.
Yeah.
By the way, there are some really important reforms going on at the moment below the radar. But anybody who tries to reform to make it more efficient, it tends to get into political hot water.
I mean, you probably understand, you would take somebody like me or participants in this call a couple of years of reading to get to the level of knowledge that you have of the British healthcare system. So now you're considered an expert, you're contributing to national debate, but you're talking to people like me who understand nothing.
But that's what I've learned in journalism, is how you do that. I actually find that people have a very shrewd sense of what matters. When I go out and talk to audiences about health, people are very clear. They know that obesity is a major problem. They don't understand why we don't put the prices of prescription medicines on the boxes so that people might actually take them and not throw them away.
Right.
They don't understand why nurses don't have proper autonomy to make decisions and why they exist in a difficult bureaucracy. I mean, people are pretty shrewd about this stuff because they do interact with the healthcare system.
Yeah.
The actual structures of the NHS are very, very difficult to understand, but actually delivering better patient care is not difficult to understand.
So having spent myself almost 20 years in the US, where the ideology of the free market is so strong, the idea that something could be owned by the government and managed well is anathema.
Yes, I know.
How well is the national healthcare system run? Let me ask you more bluntly, and it's hard because I think you spend a lot of time in Massachusetts, which actually has a single payer or something.
Yes, actually, that's true.
I guess what I'm asking you is Obamacare a good thing or not?
Gosh, there's people on this call who will know actually better than I do. Look, of course, it's a good principle. The fact that when you're in the US, people are worrying on a daily basis about whether they can afford to cover the cost of any catastrophic healthcare emergency is absolutely shocking when you come from Europe. You've got life expectancy falling in the States for the third consecutive year, which it hasn't done since World War I. And there is something, I'm afraid, seriously wrong with the American healthcare system because it's extremely expensive and it is not saving people's lives. And people are in a situation of deep anxiety and also confusion. So one of my colleagues at Harvard has done some really good work on why aren't patients more proactively shopping around? Why do they not even ask the surgeon about cost? Why don't they don't even, because we don't treat it as a market even when we're in a market, because it's actually about life and death. So of course, to try and to get more people covered was absolutely the right principle.
Yeah.
I would have quite liked it if Obama had taken on the tort lawyers as well. Because, the litigation side in the US is a real problem and drives up costs. And he didn't, unfortunately, I think he ducked that one.
Well, they all vote Democrat, so
I know.
What I'm going to do, we're not going to stay entirely on healthcare, but one person who did interact with me is this heart surgeon I talked to you about. Take a second to introduce yourself as well, Jehangir.
I'm calling in from Canada. Thanks for having me on the call, guys. You're always doing interesting stuff, and it's fun to be part of it. I focus currently on working with startup companies using technology in healthcare, a little bit what you were referring to, and really around artificial intelligence and Internet of Things in healthcare, because healthcare has generally been slow to adopt technology, and that's at an inflection point. So I work with a lot of those companies, invest in those companies. I do some consultancy looking at the future of cardiovascular intervention, and some healthcare policy work around innovation, and some healthcare research. And previously, I worked for 20 years as a heart surgeon.
Right. Okay.
I trained both in the UK and in Canada, and some time in the US as well. So I got to see 3 different systems in terms of their pros and cons, in terms of how healthcare works.
What question should I have asked Camilla that I didn't?
About healthcare, yeah. Obviously, healthcare is not easy. It's a question of trying to arrive at an optimal strategy. My thoughts are in the US, there's this issue of getting to universal care and the definition of universal care. Unlike the rest of the Western Hemisphere in the US, there's an issue about my neighbor not having a job, not paying for healthcare, and getting the same service I get. And yes. I work every day, 9 to 5. I put my boots on, I go to the factory, and this person doesn't. And the US just can't get over that stumbling block.
I agree.
The rest of the world has gotten over it. And then it's a question of how do we provide healthcare as a basic right for everyone? How do we do it efficiently? And how do we do it economically? And what are the quality of care outcomes sort of thing? But the US has a huge stumbling block mentally to get over that.
Camilla, are you known in the United States as a public commentator? I mean, the FT is broadly read in the US.
Yes, but I wouldn't say I have a great profile in the US at the moment. I mean, my book is coming out in March, so I'm going to have to up my profile in the US, no doubt.
If you were to get in front of an American audience and talk about the NHS, do you think that you could convince them of anything?
I think Jehangir is right. I think he's made absolutely the right point. And when you do see this here as well, you do see this similar concern about fairness. So the common thing I find in most audiences, at some point someone will say, well, why should I pay for people who've been smoking for 35 years? Or why should I pay for people who've been eating to excess and have now got type 2 diabetes? So we actually, funny enough, have a similar view here because, of course, it's coming out of our income taxes. But actually, Europe has, most of the rest of Europe has solved that problem by having a sort of co-payment system. So, if you're in France or Germany, as you know, Jehangir, you have a social insurance system where actually most people are paying. Right. And the prices are more transparent. I think that's the other thing about a single payer system. I will defend a single payer system forever because I actually think it is a great leveler. It does provide, as you say, health as a human right. And actually,
when you say single payer, do you mean co-payment as well, or?
In some parts of Europe, obviously, you've got co-payment. So that's a sort of more Bismarckian model, if you like. You've got a hybrid. So in Germany, I think about a third of the hospitals probably are privately owned, about a third are public, a third non-profit. So you have a sort of much more relaxed attitude to that kind of mixed economy. And people are relaxed as long as they're getting a good service. But then it comes down to how you regulate. My problem I have many problems with the US healthcare system, but one is this, it's so opaque. It's really, really difficult for individual patients to judge even what they're getting. So I understand you. I do think you're right. There's a stumbling block about people, they've paid in and other people haven't. The health problems the US is facing, it's catastrophic.
One thing on that, in terms of the opaqueness in the US healthcare system, my experience has been that the US offers a spectrum of absolutely world-class, outstanding health that is really hard to get anywhere else. But then also, on the other end, there's a lot of below average care provided. And therefore, when you take the sum of all that, it's actually not very good. When you average out the excellent with the below, it's still, for the public overall, it's not very good.
You're talking about the US,
but in the US, yeah. Whereas for individuals, you could probably access some of the best healthcare. But as a public society, the averages don't work out well. So whereas the NHS, and getting back to the NHS, the NHS, on a global scale is well looked upon and actually measures metrics and has a lot of really good deliverables.
Well, that's another. Can I just pick up on that, Guy? That's a really important point. Is that actually, as we move into this world of big data, having a universal single payer system is a huge advantage, because we ought to be running big clinical trials. We ought to be making the results of those trials available to our patients much quicker. I mean, we're now beginning to realize that in this new world, we've got a huge opportunity. And the question there is, can we overcome some of the resistance, again, to bringing in life sciences companies into that conversation? And that conversation is going on at the moment.
So, Django, one last question before I move you back to listen-only mode. What was the last question you'd like to ask Camilla?
Sure. Okay. So one of the things I really liked in your book was the chapter on Ikigai and the Venn diagram.
Oh, yeah.
And for the other listeners, the Venn diagram of what you're good at, what the world needs, what you can get paid for, what you like.
Yes.
So one interesting thing is that Venn diagram, I think, applies very differently to all of us at different times in life. So for someone who's going off to university, that's kind of interesting. It's a key way to try to think about what I want to get into. Yeah. Someone who's sort of mid-career, who's accomplished a lot, says, what do I want to do next? And then when I talk to people about this Venn diagram, nobody thinks about it for the elderly. And I thought that was beautiful, like how you brought it up, like maybe when you're 65 and 75, what opportunities there are. I wanted to sort of reflect on that and say, like, you've accomplished so much in your career, done so many different things, that maybe with time your Ikigai has changed. I was wondering, what is your Ikigai, for tomorrow, going forward, now that you've done X and done Y and done Z? What is your Ikigai today and tomorrow?
Well, that is such a profound question, I feel, right? And thank you so much for reading the book in such detail, because for those on the call who haven't read the book, I mean, Ikigai is translated as, I think, reason for being. And it is quite a complex Japanese concept that I think we in the West don't relate very well to, because we're so used to pursuing our own kind of hedonistic goals that this concept of balancing out the different parts of our lives and finding kind of inner calm is really, really difficult. And I do think that when you go into extra time, which is, my book is called Extra Time because I think we've got a whole bunch of people who are now in extended middle age. What are we going to do with that extra time is really what I'm asking in the book. Thank you very much. It is a very interesting point that when you get a bit older and have possibly a bit more time, and you might very well change your approach. And one of the things I write about in the book is going to silver centers in Japan, which was set up to help older people get part-time work and to maintain that sense of purpose rather than feeling completely redundant and unwanted in their lives. And these are kind of marvelous. They're coffee mornings, but they're coffee mornings with a purpose, where people sit around and they might draw beautiful handcrafted calligraphy for local businesses. And they're genuine, they're adding genuine value to local businesses. If you ask me, it's a really good question, because it probably reminds me that I have spent literally no time thinking about this for myself. I have 3 children still at school, and I kind of try to cram as much into my life as possible. But I don't know, I suppose I'm really, really lucky, going back to the earlier conversation, that I'm able to spend quite a lot of my career doing things I really enjoy. And I've always said to my kids in a funny way, if you can find something you're passionate about and you can get somebody to pay you to do it, that you're extraordinarily lucky. And I regard myself as extraordinarily lucky that I'm able to get paid to write about things that I'd want to write about anyway, even if nobody wanted to read about them.
Yeah. But I'm going to go to a selfish place again for me, which is that if you experience any mild degree of success, then suddenly your time, everybody wants a piece of you. I have an extraordinary assistant who helps fend all sorts of things off and gets me a little better at saying no. Actually, before we get there, how do you structure your days? When do you write? When do you see your family? What does that look like?
Oh, at the moment, when I was in number 10, I had a proper full-time job, and I actually just had that structure, and I had to cram in my family at the end of it. When I was on the Times, it was fairly similar, although I always did a 4-day week. Basically, since I've had children, I've tried to do a 4-day week, just because I've been lucky enough to do that. And I just think you have to be able to give enough attention to your children when you're not simultaneously looking at your BlackBerry and checking your emails, and we've all been guilty of that. So how do I structure my day? Well, at the moment, because I wear so many different hats, I have different days for different things. So I write my column on a specific day. I'll go into Parliament on specific days. I try to structure it that way.
So today is what kind of day, for example? Today is
the day when I've just decided what I'm going to write about in my column, and I will start making those calls once we're off this one.
And you'll finish the column?
Tomorrow afternoon.
Tomorrow afternoon. You'll start writing it this evening?
Maybe.
So you divide your week into different types of days, basically.
I try to.
So you get your family home. You met earlier on, who's about to have a child. I'm extremely respectful of and in awe of people who are the mothers in their families and their professional. I actually strongly feel that we have to give credit to that and allow you to share about that, because it's something I know very little about. It's part of transitioning from a male-dominated world to one where males and females are equal. And
I'm not sure we've entirely transitioned there yet, but anyway.
But part of that is to understand you seem to be managing it well. If you've not finished your column by 10 p.m., do you continue till 3 a.m. and then you're dreary-eyed the next morning? Or
well, as the journalist part of my life, Guy, I have worked to deadlines for 15 years. I'm a complete deadline junkie. I mean, I love deadlines and I can't now function without deadlines. So the only way I operate is I have to put in deadlines for myself, even if they're artificial.
Right.
So I wrote the book, which, by the way, I never wanted to write a book because my parents had written books and I saw it firsthand, the agony. Yeah. I just had to put in deadlines. And I would say to my agent and my publisher, will you now ring me? 3 weeks' time, you've got to ring me and you've got to say, I've got to send you that chapter. But I find the deadline creates adrenaline. I mean, not everybody's like that.
Yeah. No, people around me know about deadlines. And then I procrastinate till one day beforehand. And then it's still half a day late.
Well, this is what doing PPE at Oxford actually leads you with, isn't it?
Well, it's gotten us, those of us who did it, an extraordinarily bad name, because it seems like a lot of PPE is associated with some policy disasters. And I don't know if that's a good thing. I mean, we're accused of being shallow, of skimming everything the last minute, and then being erudite. But
the real thing I'd say is that I do a huge amount of exercise, and I always have, and I think exercise is the only thing that keeps anybody sane.
And by the way, that is an important part of your book. That I think it's a whole chapter, or probably more.
Yeah.
How you, even at older age, it reduces decline.
Oh, I mean, it's unbelievable. When I started actually reading the studies, having always done quite a bit, I was just blown away. I mean, it is just extraordinary. So there's a bunch of septuagenarians in Illinois, for example, who started jogging when it became a fad in the 1970s, and who have continued some form of exercise, aerobic exercise, ever since.
Yeah.
And the researchers found, I think, that those people are 30 years biologically younger now than their chronological age.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's not unusual. These are not professional athletes. And this is a magic cure, basically, exercise. And figuring out how we can get more people to do it is vital.
And by the way, for those of you who haven't read it, the book starts with this entertaining anecdote of a man who applies to a court to have his legal age changed because there are all sorts of things that he's not allowed to do, and he feels 20 years younger, so why can't he be considered 20 years younger?
He can't find dates on Tinder. That's his main problem. That's what he complained about in the courtroom. He can't get a date because it says he's 65 and he's actually 40. He wants to be 45.
Yeah. What exercise do you do? I
mean, nothing. I do aerobics. I do something called military fitness, which we do here, and I do tennis. I mean, I just try. I'm not a fanatic, but I do try and do it pretty much.
How many hours a week?
Oh, well, minimum 5 hours a week. I've always done.
Wow. Okay, so I have to catch up with you. I don't think
I'm not showing off. I'm just trying to say that's the key to sanity. All of us have something that we need to do to remove stress.
And by the way, another chapter in the book talks about mental agility and how there are some articles written that I read not so long ago on how if you play bridge, it prevents the onset of all sorts of mental diseases.
I guess I would just warn people against is there are millions of these articles written. There were loads of articles written about how crossword puzzles were really good for your brain. And there was a study that showed that the people who did crossword puzzles had less cognitive decline. They were still sharp. Yeah. The problem with it is that the study actually also showed that people who did crossword puzzles had started off smarter in the first place and just liked doing crossword puzzles. So actually what neuroscience is showing us that the brain remains plastic forever. That is incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
Create new neurons forever. The question is, how do you incorporate those neurons into the functional circuits of your brain? And our experiments on rodents and so on show that exercise, but social connection and challenge are all vital to incorporating those functional circuits. So if you give a mouse, a new environment with new wheels and toys and some other mice to meet, they will get better at navigating mazes than the mice stuck in a boring old cage. I mean, it's not, and this does read across to humans, by the way. And the terrifying and awful thing for those of us in our 40s or 50s right now is that we have to challenge our brains. It's not necessarily bridge. It's something you find really hard because you have to get out of this. We're all, probably a lot of us on the call, are having a rather enjoyable time exercising the same old muscle. We've done something for many years and we've become quite good at it. Maybe we're quite senior. The terrifying thing is that you've got to actually learn Arabic or take up the violin or do something that for you represents struggle. I mean, this is what the neuroscientists, they actually call it struggle. That is what your brain enjoys and responds to, and it will change its mapping.
I mean, I every now and then have somebody to come and read Hebrew newspapers with me. And actually what's a little disappointing for me is that I have a subscription to the Israeli equivalent of the New York Times. And there's a woman who comes and looks at this stuff with me. And I thought I'd improve just through that. I've been doing it now for about a year and there's zero improvement. And I'm not sure if it's helping my brain circuits.
Well, I don't know, because maybe you're struggling. It sounds like you don't find it that easy. So that could be quite a good thing.
Yeah. So what is it for you?
Well, I kind of thought, I mean, I love the piano and I thought I could get back to the piano. I find myself playing the same Chopin nocturnes, which is not helpful. I know what I need to do, which is I need to master Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto. And if I can do that, I think that will be genuine struggle.
That's one of a hell of a piece of music. Why particularly that particular?
Because it's one of my favourite pieces of music. And because our youngest child is already quite enjoys listening to it and she's soon going to be better than me. And so I need to that gives me an impetus to keep ahead.
So forgive me, audience, I'm going to have a little bit of fun here. Do you think that, so Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto is this incredible gush of emotions. And it if you go with the music, it takes you to this emotional peak and you it's like a river that you're just sliding down. And I just thought I'd ask that question because does that somehow revealing of your inner emotional life?
Oh God, I don't know. Maybe I'm deeply repressed and I can only express it through music. I mean, can I just say the reason I mentioned that is because it would be, for me, to master that would be an unbelievable struggle.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It would probably take me 10 years. Oh, no, it's just, as you say, it just takes you over.
But it's not Beethoven. It's not one of Beethoven's piano sonatas.
No, Rachmaninoff has a flair. It's much more emotional, isn't it?
That's fascinating. I want to ask...
Somebody said on here, yes, perhaps elderly can maintain brain plasticity by finding their ikigai. Yes, that is absolutely right, staying engaged.
I want to ask you about the number 10 policy unit, but I just want to see what's written here in these Q&A. There's somebody, John Green says, hi Camilla, apologies to bring the conversation back to healthcare. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the so-called dementia tax and whether it ought to be reintroduced in order to relieve the NHS of some of the burden of care for the elderly.
Yes, okay, so I actually used this phrase dementia tax in 2017 in the election because I wanted people to focus on the issue. I hadn't expected that Theresa May would then unveil a policy that was effectively a dementia tax. I mean, it was, and that policy, by the way, sunk her. I mean, it was so unpopular. It was one of the moments in the campaign where the public turned against her, and of course she lost her majority, which is one of the reasons why Brexit remains in limbo, as it were. No, look, social care is a huge issue in most countries. We don't link it to our health systems. Germany and Japan have done quite well, actually, in creating essentially social insurance schemes, which people pay into. They're slightly different, but basically after 40, most workers are paying in. They're then taking out later. And this is for people essentially to come into your house when you need help and you can't function on your own, but it keeps you out of hospital and keeps you out of care. And the way that our healthcare system is organized is we don't recognize, the NHS is not incentivized to keep people out of hospital, and we don't pay the NHS for social care. So we essentially have to pay for it ourselves. So I am looking after the finances of my wonderful aunt who has sadly got Alzheimer's. She's moved into a care home. That is costing her an incredible amount of money. And she will only afford that by selling her home. Now, there's a whole question, and it's very live in our election debate at the moment, about whether you should have to sell your home to pay for the care that if you had cancer, you would have got for free on the NHS. But because you have dementia, someone else is asking you to pay for it. So we have this essential inequity in a way between the two systems. Dementia tax, I mean, it means different things to different people, but I mean, essentially paying more in has got to happen. The only question is how we pay more in and how do we get one sort of single system that works for all of us, because we ping in and out, right? You know, you're in a care home, you fall over, you fracture your leg, you go into hospital, you come out, you see your family doctor. These things at the moment are not joined up. And we have two completely different sets of staff who manage them, and we need that to be one. And that is very, very challenging. Where the future has to be.
I think I'm going to go down this path. We'll see where it goes. So you might have to explain what a people's assembly is, or a citizens' assembly, where you pick a random group of people and you have them discuss an issue. And so this is not politics. The people aren't elected. There's no lobbyists. They have not spent their time trying to get into a career in politics. They're kind of like an expanded jury of anywhere from 100 to 1,000 people. I would imagine that question of a dementia tax, for example, would be something that would be great to put to a people's assembly.
Yes. So what exactly? So what we discover in all of these, so many of the issues that confront us right now are big, cross-generational, cross-boundary issues. Climate change, those kind of long-term healthcare issues. They're things that governments are not good at grappling with because they were voted in for 4 or 5 years. You need to see some progress. And if you're a minister, you may only be there for a year. And ministers want headlines. So you're completely right. If you take it out to a wider group of people, this is the concept of the People's Assembly, as you say, and you give them more granularity and more time to actually probe the budgetary implications, sometimes it can take the politics out of it. So in Ireland, they did this recently. They basically had a commission looking at abortion rights. And they essentially delegated that to a People's Assembly, and they got much, much wider support, as I understand it, for changing the law.
Yeah.
And that was the only way they were ever going to achieve that. So it's now very in vogue, the idea that you can use a People's Assembly. It's been suggested for all sorts of things, Brexit and so on.
Yeah.
But we do need something like that on the social care issue, or a commission or something probably to, as you say, take the politics out of it and look at it in the round. Yeah.
Is there any chance in the UK environment of getting at least some issues dealt with through a citizens' assembly?
Well, I don't know. This is an issue that Gordon Brown, in fact, suggested about a year ago, that he suggested after Brexit, we would need something to bring the country back together.
Yeah.
And I was very sceptical at the time because I thought, well, Citizens' Assembly just sounds like a kind of talking shop for years, But in fact, I now begin to wonder whether he might be right. There might be something in that.
The way it was explained to me was, if we're going to, in the United States, in the states where there's still the death penalty, it's always by jury. But there's the idea that no official, and even no elected official, wants to take that decision. And the only way that a decision ought to take somebody's freedom away for a period of time, a jury of your peers, a randomly selected jury of your peers is the best way to come to that decision.
Yes, but only if you've got a very discrete binary question to address. So
yeah, I guess.
You can't throw a more abstruse issue into a jury because it doesn't work. So I think it has to be a binary question.
Yeah. What I experience here in Switzerland, whether it comes to healthcare or other issues, is that any institution that raises the public's trust in the decision-making process is helpful. And the amount of trust here in Switzerland is just enormous on so many issues.
But you have a very local, you have the canton system, you have much more local democracy, don't you? You have referenda. Yes. People feel consulted.
And it's impressive because actually you really care about the outcomes here. You haven't abdicated the way I have just to think about making rich people richer, which is really wonderful. And something you said to me on a call was that the life of the average MP is horrible. It's a really tough job. You spend some time, presumably, with your, at least the levers of change, the most visible possible. I guess that's the number 10 policy unit.
Yeah.
Can you just describe, it must have been wonderful. You were finally there at the center of the levers of government.
Yes.
Tell us what that's like.
When you get there to the centre of government and then you find you still pull levers and they don't connect to anything. So as David Cameron always said, actually, no, it was an extraordinary experience and a great privilege. And what is very interesting, which is what you're alluding to, I think, is where do you have real power and where do you not? David Cameron was always going into that job actually very humble about, he always knew, I think, that he would eventually, he'd be out and he'd probably be unpopular. And, he was very conscious, and a lot of his ministers were very conscious. They needed to kind of use the time effectively. So they were all worried. They'd all looked at what Blair had done. And they remembered that Blair had himself said, I'd wasted time. Because he spent a long time kind of setting up strategy units and trying to figure out what to do with policy. And then he got to the end of his first 5 years and Tony Blair, felt he hadn't achieved enough. So they were all going into this thing like a sort of roller coaster. What you learn as you go through is that there are certain particular powers the Prime Minister has. There are executive powers you have, obviously, over foreign policy and intelligence, which, by the way, is what Mr. Jeremy Corbyn would acquire should he get the keys to number 10. He would not be constrained by a hung parliament in the way that people imagine, because there are certain executive powers that you control, obviously. But you can make speeches. Speeches become a hugely powerful weapon. So I was always a bit sceptical. I thought, why on earth is there so much management of the press and why are we doing so many speeches? Well, you quickly discover that, of course, that is the way that a prime minister can actually set out his stall and try to change the conversation. Because you don't change the world just through legislation. You change the world through culture and conversation. And if you take, Islamist extremism was one where David Cameron really did shift the dial in terms of the way that society even defined extremism. The biggest battle he had, Theresa May and Michael Gove had in government, was that Theresa May believed, as the security services did, that extremists should be in a small box where we could watch a certain limited number of SOI, subjects of interest. And what Michael Gove and David Cameron came to believe was, no, there is a long road that leads people up to becoming extremists. And actually, we can't just ignore them until they try to set up a bomb. We have to actually address all the way through the societal factors that might or might not lead them to becoming extremists. And we have to try and set up programs that will instill British values in their language or in some way turn people away from this, which, of course, we then saw in spades in what happened with ISIS, I'm afraid. You can start to set out your stall through speeches. You can use Prime Minister's questions to some extent to change the tone. But it's amazing when you sit at the apex of power as a Prime Minister or in many political leaders, and you have a Rolls-Royce civil service stretching out through Whitehall, and yet you want something done, and you're told, well, you need a feasibility study, and then you need a consultation, and the system is brilliant at inertia. And that can be good if you've got a Prime Minister you're worried about who's going to be reckless, or it can be quite frustrating if you think you've got a guy who's on the right path.
So are you able, stand on one leg in 3 milliseconds or maybe 3 minutes? Just for me, it's fascinating to get an example of something where you believe that passed across your desk where your time in office was successful, where it was like, wow, we actually did manage. You actually gave an example of just through speeches of changing the topic of how people become extremists. I just come away from that thinking, well, duh. It's like, how hard is that to understand?
No, but that was a huge political controversy, all I'm saying. And in the end, the way he addressed it was actually by using speeches to leverage change. That's all I'm trying to explain, rather than sitting in committees with people who didn't agree. It's rather like the way we did the sugar tax on drinks. We put it in a budget. We didn't let all the people who wanted to stop us sit round in endless committees for months and months and months.
Right.
Sometimes you do that. Look, David Cameron and George Osborne came into power after the financial crisis when Britain had a very large deficit. And this is all forgotten. They came out of power with record high employment in a country that actually, yes, we still had a way to go on making up wages from 2008, but a country that was doing a lot better than many people would have thought with a substantially reduced deficit. Now, they had to make a lot of difficult decisions to achieve that. Some people say now in an environment of low interest rates, was that really important? Did it matter? For them, it was hugely important. And for our credit rating and for the country's reputation, it was important. And that involved making a lot of very tough decisions. But there were a lot of other decisions under the radar. So, one thing that I cared about a lot was the way we look after children in care and the way we run social services, which is again through local government. One thing we did when I was in number 10 is we took over Birmingham's Council Social Services, the largest council outside London, which had been failing for 10 years. And we eventually just thought we'll take it over and set up an independent trust. And that was a tiny little thing that actually took a lot of work to make that decision and is now, well, we'll see where we get to, but is now starting to be part of a wider policy of transforming the way we look after kids who are at the bottom of the heap. You're making decisions like this every day. There's millions of decisions.
Something I don't understand Swiss politics well enough, but just from the surface and the distance, something that I feel is unhealthy in the UK is the degree to which power is centred in London and in the central arms of central government. That's nice to say that and nice to make a comparison with a country where power is decentralised. I have no idea if you're in government how you implement the decentralisation. What do you do?
To be fair, George Osborne would agree with you. So one thing that, again, nobody has noticed fully or appreciated quite the implications of, obviously, Tony Blair devolved power to the regions. The reason you're now seeing Scotland demanding another independence referendum is he started to devolve real power.
Yeah.
And you can disagree or agree with that. George Osborne started to devolve power to local authorities. So in Greater Manchester, where there was an extraordinary council leader, I mean, huge amounts of power have now been devolved over economic development. We have mayors all over the country, powers devolved actually for the health and social care system. So extraordinary amounts of innovation are happening at a local level. Again, under the political radar, so, people can get on with improving services without taking a political hit in the media, I think. And that's actually very exciting, but it hasn't, it hasn't. I mean, you've got Rory Stewart will run for Mayor of London. The next Mayor of London will be very interesting. The next Mayor of London will surely want to take more power.
Yeah. And by the way, my belief is, without having any experience of it, is that as the powers get devolved, people will become more experienced in the exercise of local power. And the initial experiences may be that there's some bad choices that are made, but over time, those choices will improve as people get more knowledgeable. But
if you think back to Thatcher, I mean, I suppose what happened was, you had militant tendency, for those of you who remember this, back in the 1980s, bubbling up through local authorities. So you had socialists trying to gain control of the levers of power, and Thatcher essentially removed a lot of power from local authorities in order to quell those people. But that left us with a much more centralised system.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's on the ground, and local authorities have had funding cut consistently. But as a result, actually, some of them have become extremely entrepreneurial in the way that they do business.
I've spent whole afternoons here, Camilla, with Parliament Live playing as I watch debates on Brexit. And there's kind of the opportunity to do that now, which is
We're going to miss John Bercow.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, of course.
Become a celebrity. He's getting his own show, I think.
Not surprising.
More of him in the future.
So if I understand Rory Stewart's position, Rory Stewart says Brexit, not a great idea, but the British public voted for it. And the point that he made to me that was most convincing was he said the UK cannot have a sensible discussion about Europe anymore from inside. His view is that UK has to find some position outside of Europe before it can even begin to have an effective discussion.
Yeah, somebody in the chat, somebody asked, what did we think about Rory Stewart's idea? Jonathan, what do we think about Rory Stewart's idea of mediating Brexit via a People's Assembly?
Yes. I just said, I love that idea. Yeah. And I'm hardcore Remain, but go ahead, Camilla.
Well, but I mean, the reason Rory wanted to do that was precisely because we have not, as a country, really grappled with the actual trade-offs involved in exiting the EU. And we've had this sort of conspiracy of silence about the real economic trade-offs, and in particular for services. I mean, what's extraordinary about and so depressing about our political debate in the last 3 years, it's largely been about goods. Britain is a powerhouse of services. We depend unbelievably heavily on services for our economy, the City of London, there is almost no debate at all, either in Parliament or the media, about the prospects of the services economy in whatever way we leave the EU. And there was, because Theresa May ruled out essentially remaining in the single market at all, we have done potentially appalling damage to our services. Now, a lot of banks and insurance companies are on a passport. They're finding ways to, obviously, people are setting up subsidiaries all over in Ireland and Holland and so on, and we don't yet know how negotiations will proceed. But I mean, that is clearly a very damaging and worrying situation, which most people in this country are entirely unaware of, and they will be unaware of until the jobs disappear. And I think that's where I wouldn't mind having a People's Assembly that exposed that, but we shouldn't need a People's Assembly to expose that. We've got Parliament, we've got a free media.
Yeah.
And in a way, I suppose, back to your question, people aren't listening. So what's happened is that people have become more entrenched in their views.
It's not like the moderate voices aren't there. They are there.
They are there, yeah.
It's just that nobody's listening to them.
Well, and you've got to understand that it's an issue of identity, cultural identity. It's not just about economics. So Remainers, and I am a Remainer, but Remainers tend to make the economic argument, you must all be able to see that we may lose, all these jobs from Toyota and so on, which is completely true. A lot of Leave voters, including my late father, were not interested in that at all. They didn't believe it either. My father never believed that the economy would suffer. He didn't understand global supply chains. He didn't want to know about them. But it was an issue of cultural identity. And so if you were wealthy and middle class, as my father was, not particularly wealthy, but in middle class, educated, his view was, we want our sovereignty back. And if you were in large parts of the country, which, to be honest, since 2004 and opening the doors to the accession countries as Blair did, ahead of most other countries, and then, of course, deceiving people about how many Eastern Europeans would arrive, which was his big mistake. I mean, he should have just been honest and he should have welcomed those people in and created much better infrastructure, but he didn't. People will say, well, actually, I don't recognize my area. I don't recognize this country. I'm worried about where it's going. I want to be patriotic. And patriotism for those people means taking back control of their borders and their cultural identity. Now, we can all say it's a lot more complicated than that. And we can also say that some of the hostility to immigration has nothing to do with the EU. It's the rest of the world, and there's all sorts of very complex issues underlying that. But I think until Remainers acknowledge the identity questions, they're never going to win this argument.
Forgive me, I've asked this multiple places. I haven't asked this from you. Here in Switzerland, so you'll enjoy this, Camilla, within a month of arriving, I get a letter saying, please show up at the population registration office and show evidence of your healthcare plan.
Wow.
But for some reason or other, in my wife and children's case, we could do it pretty quick. And I had some paper issue that it took me 4 or 5 months.
Right.
So month 3 comes along, and I get a letter in the mail saying, you're now 3 months late. Here's a bill, or the fact that we've had to send you a letter
yes.
of about 150 Swiss francs. And then by month 4, I show up at the office, there's another bill. Bottom line is, the rule, and Switzerland, for this purpose, is part of the EU, Switzerland only has to allow somebody to be here for 3 months. And after that, unless they have full employment and they have a healthcare plan, they got to leave.
Yes.
Why on earth was it never possible to have the United Kingdom take advantage of those rules, which are available to it as a member state?
Switzerland is not in the EU.
No, but those are the rules within the EU. So Switzerland has to exceed. Switzerland doesn't like that.
During the renegotiation in 2015, I mean, this was a major part of the renegotiation. The whole question was, what is discriminatory and what isn't? And the fundamental problem was that we have in Britain a sort of universal welfare state with universal benefits, where we do say, everybody who's here gets, free education and free access to healthcare, because that's our system. And most of the rest of Europe operates on a more Napoleonic, Bismarckian type system. And a lot of those countries, as you say, have been able to use all sorts of ways. I mean, I think in Denmark, you have to own a home before you can get certain rights, and then it's quite difficult to buy a home. And so, I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which the French have been deporting people for longer. I think we were up against a very difficult situation, which was that freedom of movement is a fundamental pillar of the European Union. So one of the things that came out in the campaign was that people were very angry that British taxpayers were paying child benefits to children living in Warsaw. But the EU would not budge on those issues. I mean, I do honestly think if the EU had been a little bit more flexible on some of this, we would not be where we are now.
Why not just change domestic British law to be a little bit more like those Napoleonic?
Well, I actually, funny enough, I have argued for years for doing that. But when you say just change, I mean, we would need to create a contributory welfare system, which is a completely different animal than we've had. And I don't believe we would have got it through Parliament. I don't believe any government would get that through Parliament without the very long-term type of consultation process you talked about earlier. But I think that was a fundamental mismatch between the two, which at that point, because we were such a successful economy and we were drawing so many people here who wanted to work from other economies which were under a cloud, it just became imbalanced at that particular point in time.
And now the British politics has just rolled the dice. The idea that everybody is thinking about how to vote tactically to try and get an outcome, that even if they do all the analysis in the world, it's kind of random what's going to come out of this.
Yes.
Is that the political crisis that Britain is in? And is there any way to cut through that if you are sensible-minded?
Yes, clearly the number of seats in which Remainers like you, who put that issue above all our others, the number of seats where you could tactically vote to make a difference is falling. It's only about 45, I think, now. The Liberal Democrats' support has cratered. I mean, according to the polls, by the way, and we don't all believe polls because those of us who've lived through elections and worked in newspapers know that the polls are often wrong, but the Liberal Democrats are not picking up support for their revoke policy. And that does indicate there's a lot of Remainers who are deeply uncomfortable with the idea that the Liberal Democrats could, or anybody could come to power and just say, we're going to erase Brexit and pretend it never happened. I do think that most people believe in a second referendum because at least that pays some attention to the previous referendum. You can't have a massive democratic experiment in a referendum and then just erase it overnight. much as some of us would like to do that for the sake of the economy. I think the societal problems and backlash that would create would be disastrous.
We've all heard this thing. So I support a second referendum, and people say, "Oh, what? Then do you have a third one, a fourth one, one best of three?" And my answer to them is absolutely. We can have 10 referendums. We keep going. That's the nature of politics.
But that's the experience in Switzerland and indeed in California. But of course, we're just not used to that. We're not used to referendums at all. And so we're not used to the idea that you can have, as you say, a second and a third.
And there are issues here that I only looked up on Wikipedia where there are about 10 referenda, and it took about 50 or 60 years to settle. But that's fine, And
it isn't fine, though, because people who were asked to vote and were told, unfortunately, by a government that it would respect the outcome of that vote, and have, by the way, been told by every single party in Parliament that they will respect the outcome of that vote, all of which did vote to have a referendum and then voted to trigger Article 50. I mean, it is not an impressive history if you believe that it's potentially a tragedy for our nation. It's not an impressive history. Those politicians, I'm afraid, have gone along with that view. And I think where we're at now is maybe we'll get a hung parliament, but the truth is that prolonged uncertainty is really crippling us. It is crippling not just individual investment decisions, but actually, I think, individuals' psychological stress.
Yeah.
Most people I talk to in business are feeling increasingly beleaguered by the volatility in the world, global geopolitical volatility, and this prolonged uncertainty.
Yeah. And
that's why I think the Tory slogan, "Get Brexit Done," which is a sort of mendacious illusion, is very effective. Got fatigue, and we know perfectly well that this is going to be far more complex. A Canada minus free trade deal is not a good outcome, but a lot of people feel they just can't bear to think about it anymore.
Have you heard about Germany Plus?
No, that's a new one on me.
It's from listening to James O'Brien. So I now listen to people like Ian Dunt and James O'Brien. For those of you who don't know, these are not hard leftists, but these are members of the Labour Party that I never thought I had anything in common with. Germany Plus is effectively the deal that the UK has today with the EU. It's everything that Germany has, but without membership of the Euro, without ever closer political union, without membership of Schengen. It's got these amazing advantages. But let's go to... So Camilla, one of the things, I'll tell you what is distressing to me, and much less distressing for living in Switzerland, but Switzerland's a tiny country, is the crisis of the West. So both the large Anglo-Saxon economies are kind of in a crisis mode in that we have populists running the country who are making decisions based on what feels good to the broad electorate rather than what makes sense. Meanwhile, anybody who's been to China sees extraordinary infrastructure, happy people for all of the lack of freedom in China. Tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of Chinese leave China every year and happily and voluntarily come back. And we can all recognize that China is not a free society. I feel like you and I were indoctrinated into this idea of liberal democracies. Liberal democracies are failing, and we're at the center of them. What are we supposed to do? And is this the end of liberal democracy?
That's the question of the moment, isn't it? I mean, I think I would slightly take issue with you on China. I think since Xi took over, I think we've seen a much harder line from China. We've seen censorship. I know what you mean, but I don't regard that as an acceptable model, and I don't actually think it's necessarily sustainable. I do think there are deep cultural issues within that society which probably will bubble up at some point, and we'll see what happened in Hong Kong. But I think there is an increasing threat from that idea that somehow economics is all, and if you just give people enough prosperity, they'll go along with any kind of level of state control. I mean, that terrifies me. But I know what you mean. I mean, liberal economies, we do have to rein in free market capitalism a bit. If free market capitalism is going to succeed, it needs to be responsible and properly regulated. And I think on so many areas, we have failed to properly regulate it. But I don't think that's impossible to deal with.
I'll push back at you. I want to agree with you, but the Communist Party in China is 60 million people. It's almost like it's the size of the population of the UK. As I understand it, the deal in China is you are welcome to discuss politics within the Communist Party. Join the Communist Party, and then you can have raging political debates. And if you want to publish something that's politically sensitive, we prefer you don't publish it in public, so you restrain your freedom of speech to the general public. But the people who make policy can certainly see what you write. And there are plenty of dissident writers who are invited to write for Communist Party organs.
How chilling do you think that is? Wow. I mean, how many people are going to express their genuine opinion even within the internal party if it's telling them they can't express that outside? And if, by the way, as I wrote in the FT recently, it is also putting pressure on institutions of free speech all over the West. I mean,
yes.
That's self-censorship. There's something that happens in those situations, which is they may sound plausible, but they lead to self-censorship.
And what they say, what that system would say is, they say, yeah, there is a certain amount of self-censorship, but we're not about the ability to express yourself on every topic irresponsibly is not what we like. What we want is effectiveness.
What they want, Guy, is power. They want permanent power. They are a despotism. They are an authoritarian government, and they are increasingly looking like an authoritarian government, and they are relinquishing small amounts of power where they know they need to in order to maintain this juggernaut that's moving forward. And they do that extremely subtly and extremely effectively. But don't mistake it for any form of freedom.
So their response is to say, yeah, freedom is overstated. We're effective. We have well-run cities. We have good airports. We have train systems that work.
Look at Switzerland. It's got a fantastically well-run train system.
Switzerland is extraordinarily unusual, and Singapore is a much less free society. And by the way, there are so many countries in the world that say we like the Chinese model more. And the Western model is failing miserably. We're not succeeding.
No, we're
not having sensible debates. Look at the UK.
I think the US, unfortunately, at the moment is going through a period when it is being seen to be hypocritical, and it's not standing by the values that it has historically wanted to project across the world. I think that is a major concern. And whether that's a permanent phase, none of us know. Hopefully it's not.
One of the biggest fears that anybody who's lived or lives in the US has is that, this is the American Constitution is this amazing experiment that has lasted all of 200 years. And maybe one of these days soon, the center won't hold and it will all collapse.
I think something different is going to happen. I think we've had a disengagement from politics of highly talented people for about 20 years. I think for about 20 years, the best and brightest in their societies, certainly in the UK, just didn't even consider politics as a career. And you didn't consider politics as a career, did you? I mean, most people didn't. And now we are seeing, and I see it at Harvard because I have a lot of British students there who are the best and brightest of their generations. They are much more politically engaged than my equivalent group was there 25 years ago. We are going to see, rather like, an En Marche, the Macron built En Marche, which was effectively a brand new political movement. Half of the candidates in that political movement had never stood for office before. Yeah. We're going to see something similar like that, which will bring it back to the centre. Now, we can debate what we mean by the centre, but something that is much more rational and evidence-based. And what I hope is that some of the business people who are now seeing for the first time just how dangerous politics can be, who've never had to worry about politics before, are going to get involved and are actually going to run. And if there's people involved, we're not going to solve this problem.
Not that I'm ever going to run, but I'm an example of that in that I've gone and joined all these political parties and I am politically engaged.
Getting more engaged, yeah. I'm quite hopeful about that, actually.
By the way, one of the people just wrote that they ordered your book. It's Mark Hughes. Mark, feel free to order 20 or 30 copies and send them to all your friends. They will be very, very happy with you.
So Michael's question is, how does poll attendance vary between the young and the old? Will populism and healthcare concerns among the old concentrate and change political power, which is, of course, a very live and perennial question. And at the moment, poll attendance has been much greater among the old. And I just saw a poll today that suggested that is still going to be the case, that quite a lot of young people still haven't signed up to vote, may not turn out to vote. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the danger of that is that we just see the grey vote, as it were, securing a larger and larger share of the pie. And the Conservative manifesto, rather to my dismay, just plays into that again by upholding all of the pension benefits and so on, that actually we have helped to vanquish pensioner poverty, which is a great thing. But we've indexed pensions, not just to inflation, but to 2.5%, which was now in an era of low interest rates and low inflation, rather a mistake. So yes, I think we are going to see those concerns concentrate more, except for the fact, and one of the things I write about a lot is multi-generational questions. Of course, the bank of mum and dad is now funding the younger generation, and the grandparents I interview are increasingly worried about the grandchildren. So in fact, weirdly, the generations are becoming more connected, not less. So I think that you're getting grandparents who will vote for more housing, for example, and they'll stop being NIMBYs and so on. They'll want more healthcare for themselves, but they are also quite concerned about the young. And I just hope that will start to come through in some of these polls.
Camilla, I was going to talk about, just a pet peeve for me, I'm so impressed with the way Singapore pays its top civil servants in parity. And I think that I would love to see the UK do that. I think that parliamentarians should be paid 5 or 6 times what they're paid to make their lives easier, but also to recognize the incredibly important job that they do. It's probably not even worth discussing because I'm just being completely naive. I don't know if
you are, I'm afraid, because we wrote editorials on that in the Times about 10 years ago and got monstered because obviously parliamentarians earn a lot more than the national average, and so people will say, well, these people are all mediocre anyway and they only work in parliamentary sessions and they have long holidays and so on. It's really difficult. The civil service point is fundamental, and actually Dominic Cummings, who's effectively the Prime Minister's kind of chief of staff at the moment, has long believed that the civil service in Britain needs a major, major shake-up. And I think he probably believes that we need fewer people who are much, much, much better paid. And when you meet the officials in Singapore, they are so effective.
Yeah.
Somebody's just written, no, you pay your officials enough so they're not suborned. Yes, quite.
Camilla, I just want to go to, what are your favorite written sources? What are you reading? Books, magazines, columnists? Who needs to be amplified, in my mind?
I don't know about all of you guys, but I like to read things that I disagree with, as well as things I agree. So the thing I always try and remember to do is to read people I really disagree with as well. And I think we should all have a few of those who just make us furious, because they always help me to crystallize my thoughts. And in England, I tend to read Polly Toynbee, who's a Guardian columnist who's marvellous and who I almost always disagree with, but is really, really well informed. Well, Christopher Hitchens, I still read now, even though he's passed on, because I just think his style of writing and his incisiveness is extraordinary.
Yeah.
I love people like Peggy Noonan and Maureen Dowd in the States. I think these women are just extraordinary. And I increasingly like those kind of feisty opinion writers, I suppose. People like Tom Friedman who look for trends and so on. I read Matthew Paris at the Times, is just the golden oldie of moderate. I mean, he's also a very interesting weather vane for, if you like, it's where the moderate centre is, I suppose, Guy. I mean, he's now actually left. I think he's left the Conservative Party and joined the Liberal Democrats. But I mean, he's a kind of very thoughtful, discursive kind of writer. He's not shrill. And I think in an age where all of us are getting more shrill, those people are worth a lot. But I've actually started going back in my reading. I mean, I've started to read things like, Rosamund Lehman and the old Virago novelists and Margaret Atwood in her older books. Because I suppose I'm just looking for really great writing, and I sometimes can't bear to actually look at what's going on in the modern world.
So what's on your bedside table right now?
Well, what's my best? Samantha Power's new book, which I'm looking forward to reading because she's a fellow at the Kennedy School with me, but she's also, she's an extraordinary, it's her story of her life, I think.
Yeah.
And I think, as a woman, what she achieved in becoming such a senior advisor to Obama and fighting for human rights, when she says herself she came from a fairly modest background, I mean, that's very impressive. I'm reading Daniel Pink, I think it's called Thrive, which is about motivation, because the next phase of my research is actually about motivation and how can we change behavior. So I'm really, really interested in how do we get people, for example, to exercise more, and how can we all stop ourselves from damaging our own health. Those kind of things are on my shelf. What else is on my shelf? Oh, well, Michelle Obama's book, which I haven't read yet.
Do you distinguish between reading for research and reading for pleasure?
I suppose my secret, back to the question you asked at the top of the conversation, is I love crime thrillers. It's the way I relax.
So this is like Agatha Christie type?
Oh, I mean, Jeffrey Archer is my secret. I mean, it's awful. I mean, my family is so embarrassed. I just love that. I love pacey plots and terrible crime thrillers. That's what I read to relax. I mean,
I'm curious. Have you read? We once, maybe you hadn't written them. Have you read any of Robert Caro's books?
Yes, I have. Marvelous, very large. You're showing your seriousness there, Guy. A large tone.
No. Actually, I'll tell you for your interest. So we went. I don't know why I'm telling you this online, but I guess now I have to finish. So I was determined to read 2 big books. I read War and Peace finally on a cruise with my family. And I would say that it's such an amazing book. I kind of fell in love with some of the characters. I read, because I felt like I didn't want to die having not read it, James Joyce's Ulysses.
Oh,
which I kind of skimmed bits of it. I let it waft over me, and it was an interesting experience, and maybe I'll read it again.
Try Virginia Woolf's The Waves then. That's the next book, Virginia Woolf's The Waves.
Is that right? I've not read
I'm
any.
trying to do something similar, but it's more readable.
Oh, is that right? I've not read any Virginia Woolf. So I discovered Audible, and I'm listening to Robert Cairo's Path to Power while riding my bicycle with the new Sports Beats headphones, and it is such an awesome experience. And
is this where you get your investing ideas from? I wonder how much actually that helps you think more laterally about investment.
That is a great question, Camilla. For a future conversation, this has been so much fun, Camilla. We're at 28 minutes past the hour. I'm going to leave you the last word before we stop this call. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's been an enormous amount of fun. Camilla, last thoughts.
Well, it's just been great. I mean, I love the format. I mean, it's just like sitting in a cafe and having this conversation, but being able to keep one eye on interesting people, making nice comments on the side. And by the way, thank you for everyone who's enjoying this. I mean, I think we didn't really know how this would work, did we? So this, just being able to rove across a number of issues is marvelous. And it's like a psychotherapy session.
Another thought to dive into, but thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much for listening to Cappuccino and Conversation with Guy Spear. You can find me on the internet at www.guyspear.com, and my social media handle is gspear, so you can find me on Twitter and other places at gspear, so Twitter/gspear. And my personal Facebook page is gspear, so if you want to find me, if you don't find me there, you can find me at gspear66.